Nestor Kirchner once said, an agreement cannot be the result of an imposition. Keep this in mind as we discuss today with one of our guests the implication of the no return to the Iran agreement signed in 2015 and how that may impact the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East and around the world. My name is Dr. David Oualaalou.
And my name is Dr. Ross Stewart.
And you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
Viewers, we listened to what you requested. And our guest today, you requested him over and over and over again, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Dr. Trita Parsi is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's also the founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Dr. Parsi appeared on many TV channels providing his insights on foreign policy matters. He is the author of Treacherous Alliance, A Single Roll of the Dice, and Losing an Enemy. Dr. Parsi, we're so happy to have you with us today.
Pleasure is all mine.
Great. So, well, we got a lot to cover.
Do we ever?
A lot. So we're going to dive into it right away, Trita. So I would like to start our conversation by asking the key question that some of our viewers have been asking. Did the United States make the mistake when it withdraws from the JCPOA agreement that was signed in 2015?
Absolutely. There is no doubt in my mind. And let me explain why. First of all, we can talk about the implications of the deal itself, what it achieved, and what we have lost as a result of the pullout. But before I go there, let me also say this. The JCPOA in many ways was a counterpoint to the Iraq War, in the sense that in the Iraq War, we had an unjustified war based on lies, invaded a country. It was the most destabilizing event of the Middle East as a whole. It has cost the United States a tremendous amount in terms of blood and treasure. And of course, the Iraqi people have suffered tremendously. And there were points in which Iraqi officials were not even clear whether Iraq would be able to remain a country. And that question is not entirely answered yet. So it was an absolute disaster. And it was a unilateral action. We didn't listen to allies. We pushed for it very aggressively. And it was done in order to be able to dominate the Middle East. Then you have the opposite. You have a very, very severe crisis in terms of what the Iranians were doing with their nuclear program. Mm-hmm. And instead of going to war, instead of acting unilaterally, there was an extensive diplomatic effort that involved not just allies, but also rivals of the United States, the entire P5+1, Russia, China, Germany, France, the UK, together negotiating, coming to a common position amongst themselves first, and then negotiating with the Iranians. It was the first time that I can recall, in a very long time, in which a major crisis that was on the verge of a major military confrontation was resolved without a single bullet being fired, and it was resolved diplomatically. If we approach many of the other conflicts that we have around the world and challenges that exist in the same manner, using this blueprint, we will live in a much better world, a much more peaceful world, and a much better prosperity for the American people itself. So in and of itself, we had a model that should have been built upon, not being trashed in the manner that it was, not just because of the specifics of the deal, but also because of the promise that that model provided for us in future challenges that we will, without a doubt, be facing. If we then look at the specifics of the deal itself.
Yeah, again, because many Trita have been wondering about, okay, where is the credibility of not only the United States in this matter, but also where is our sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Our commitment to when we sign an agreement, an international one that is, and all of a sudden we just take a step back and said, oops, we're not going to do it because we feel like it.
You know, you put your finger on something tremendously important. And I want to get back to that later on when we talk about the situation today, because we are paying the price for that credibility loss that occurred with us pulling out of that agreement. And it's an extremely important point because we cannot expect other countries to trust the United States.
Oh, yeah.
We have lost the moral high ground on that account. And if we can't have agreements, then it's going to be a complete law of the jungle, and that's certainly not going to be to the benefit of the United States or any other country. And this is particularly true in the context that we are in today. The greatest national security threat the United States faces today is not that another country, Russia, China, Iran, could attack the US militarily. The greatest threat we have to the lives of Americans and humans as a whole is climate change. And for that, we need to have a far greater degree of human collaboration to be able to address it. If we are starting that process by making sure that no one trusts us,
Oh, yeah.
then
Yeah.
rest assured, we will not succeed. And history will also not forgive us for having committed that. But going back to your original question of why this was a mistake in terms of, what did we lose in the agreement itself? Look, the Iranians had roughly 10,000 kilos of low enriched uranium around 2015. You need about 1,200 kilos of low enriched uranium to build the bomb. They had enough material for about 8 bombs. The deal ensured that 98% of that low enriched uranium was pulled out of the country and is no longer in Iran.
Mm.
That meant that the Iranians at most only could have 400 kilos of LEU on their own soil. If you don't have the LEU, you can't build a bomb. 98%. They had 22,000 centrifuges. Those are the machines that you use to spin and enrich the uranium to a higher level. That was reduced to 5,000, which meant that the combination of these different measures, and there's other measures as well, if the Iranians ever were to be so stupid, frankly, to go and try to build a bomb and make a decision, a political decision to build a bomb, it would still take them a full year undetected to be able to have enough material for a bomb. Now, thanks to the inspections regime that was put in place, the most intrusive inspections that ever have existed, then the Iranians would have been caught not within a year, but within a week, probably within a couple of days. That's the best possible guarantee we could have gotten that there would not be a move towards a bomb on the Iranian side. Now, as a result of pulling out, we now have lost a tremendous amount of that inspections insight. Many of the cameras of the IAEA are no longer functioning. They were functioning, but the Israelis blew up one of the sites in Iran and destroyed the cameras. And the Iranians have stopped collaborating to a certain extent with the IAEA because we pulled out. So those cameras are not being replaced, and the ones that are still there are not operating. Moreover, they're now starting to build more LEU, so they have far more than 400 kilos on their own soil. In fact, altogether, when you make that measurement of breakout, meaning from the time you make a decision to build a bomb to the point in which you actually have enough material for a bomb, which was 12 months under the deal, has now apparently shrunk to roughly 8 weeks. That's what we have lost. The idea that Bibi Netanyahu presented, that the deal paves the way for Iran to get a bomb, is absolutely nonsensical. Pulling out of the deal has made things much, much more dangerous than it was before. And it's one of those things, and perhaps we truly have to lose it before we understand the value of it.
Oh my God. So is this means, Trita? I mean, I know a little bit about this because I wrote a book about Iran right after the agreement was reached. So I delved deeper into the research to get to the bottom of where things could go and where they might be. Now, based on what you just said, could this mean that now Iran could be, if it wants, on its way to have the bomb?
Unfortunately, because of the loss of the inspections, because the loss of the restrictions that were put, if the Iranians were to make a decision to go in that direction, they could likely dash for it, have it within a couple of weeks. And the question is if the inspections at this point are sufficient to be able to detect them. I don't think we've seen any signs that that is really what they want. To just put it in context, Pakistanis went from 0 to a nuclear bomb in 9.5 years. They had nothing. They built a nuclear program and a nuclear weapon in 9.5 years. The Iranians have had a nuclear program since 1968. In fact, the first reactor they got was given to them by the United States as a gift. If they truly only want the nuclear bomb, meaning that they are in the same boat as the Pakistanis who felt that they absolutely needed to have it because India had nuclear weapons, then we have to answer the questions. What's taken them so long? That's not to say that we should be confident that they won't want it at some point. And that's why the deal was so important. The deal ensured that we didn't have to rely on an analysis of their intentions, which always would end up having an element of speculation. Instead, we could rely on the fact that the inspections and the other restrictions were so strict that they simply didn't have the option, regardless of what their intent is. Now they're starting to be able to have that option against because we pulled out, and that is not a good situation.
Wow. Well, this is why some analysts have been arguing, well, no. For Iran to come back to the negotiating table, they have to adhere by the new rules that the United States is trying to impose. I just read an article this morning, and it came from none other than the Heritage Foundation, so institute that is. And the argument was, well, we have to, if Iranians want the sanctions lifted, they have to adhere to the new conditions. And the argument that some analysts are making is like, why should be there new conditions when it was the United States that withdrew from the deal originally in the first place? And it doesn't make any sense. And to me, where I see it going, Trita, is that this is nothing but a reflection of how fragmented American foreign policy is. What do you think?
I think you're quite correct. And I think it goes back to the fact that some folks still believe that we are in a position to just be able to cost-free impose our will on other countries, and that they don't have any choice but to accept that. If that ever truly was true, that is no longer true in the world that we live today. We are clearly in a multipolar world. Russia, well, actually, China's power is far greater than it was before. We're seeing the United States being challenged in many different ways.
Right.
This point that we're in right now should not be coming now. I mean, I personally believe it would have happened at some point inevitably. But for it to happen this soon, only 25 years after the unipolar moment, is an indication of how badly we handled unipolarity, because we lost it very quickly. Because of all of these needless, endless wars, all of these different things that we've done that actually have ultimately harmed the US's own power. But nevertheless, so much of Washington still lives in the era in which we think that we can conduct ourselves that way. And we cannot. And this is part of the reason why there is a deadlock in these agreements. The Iranians want some form of mechanisms to, perhaps the word guarantee is too strong, but some mechanisms that ensure that the United States is not going to pull out of the deal again. Because here's what it's really about in this case. There is no sanctions relief unless that sanctions relief is long-term and stable.
Right.
When you have a situation in which a country imposes sanctions, then lifts the sanctions as part of a deal, but then reimposes them, the thing that happens is that companies don't trust that sanctions will be kept off. And as a result, they don't care if there's a new deal. Even if the US lifts the sanctions, many of these companies are not going to go back into the Iranian market, because not because they think the Iranians are going to do something, but because they don't trust the stability of US decision making.
Wow.
And the end result of that is that the Iranians actually don't get the economic benefit that they're supposed to be getting in order to agree to all of these restrictions. So if they're not getting the benefits, they're also not going to agree to the restrictions. And then we're going to end up in this deadlock that we're currently are. We caused a credibility loss for the United States ourselves. It is on us, not the Iranians or the Europeans or the Chinese or Russians, to rebuild America's credibility in order to make sure that it's not just our threats that need to be credible, but also our promises. Because if our promises are not credible, then we're not going to be able to get countries to come to agreements with us, because they don't trust that we will deliver. And we're in a bizarre situation right now in which, even if the Iranians were to come to an agreement and say they're going to take a risk and hope against all odds that the United States is going to keep the sanctions off, guess what? European companies are still not going to go into Iran. They're going to be more hardline than the paranoid leaders of the Iranian government, because they have better things to do, and they are not in the mood of going into Iran and then be chased out again because Congress or the US president changes his mind. Just as an example, the Spanish company Repsol, who's in the energy field, lost $500 million because of Trump's decision. And you know, there's no compensation given to them. And they're just not going to go back in, knowing that this is such an unstable position. Usually when countries make those decisions, the companies make those decisions because they think the country is unstable. In this case, it has nothing to do with the instability of the country. It's actually a sufficiently stable country to be able to attract that type of investment. It's the instability of where the US is on the JCPOA that is the problem right now.
Interesting. Well, this before I turn it over to you, Ross, I just need to do a follow-up with Trita on this particular point. Could this now mean, Trita, that paved the way for example, China, another player that we are noticing its growth, the role that is in the Middle East? It's not to the extent of what the United States is, whatever, but we can see China's getting into the Middle East. And the deal they just signed with Iran over the $400 billion deal, could this explain what you just talked about by having companies from the West hesitating into going back because of the issue is we don't trust what the Americans are going to do?
It is a couple of things about that China agreement. I think the Iranians themselves have exaggerated the importance of that agreement. I don't think there is a $400 billion number. It's been thrown around. Okay. I looked at the text. There is nothing in the text that specifies that number. Essentially, I think that is an estimation of what the trade could be, and it's not necessarily a bad estimation.
That is so different from how this is being portrayed in the media.
Oh yeah, no, it's been portrayed as if Iran is now a strategic ally of China, etc. The Chinese are very careful. The Chinese have a very different approach than the United States does. They want to be able to get energy from the Middle East. They want to be able to trade. They want to be able to build the Belt and Road Initiative and get their own people out of poverty without taking sides or getting entangled in the conflicts of Middle Eastern states themselves. We do the opposite. We cannot wait until we're part of another conflict. And we get ourselves entangled in all these things all the time. The Chinese have no interest. So whatever they do with Iran, they will do something equivalent with Saudi Arabia. In fact, their agreement, their 25-year agreement with Saudi Arabia was already signed a couple of years ago, I think in 2016. Iran is one of the last countries to get such an agreement. It could very well end up, creating a trade of $400 billion theoretically down the road. But I don't think the number is set. But what it does mean is that the Chinese, after years of the Iranians trying, have now come to the agreement that they do want to have a 25-year strategic agreement with the Iranians. Before, the Iranians were seeking it, but the Chinese were the ones that were hesitant. They've now come on board. It does change matters because now Iran is also part of the Shanghai Conference. So Iran, which was very politically and strategically isolated, now suddenly actually is part of international groupings, etc., that it wasn't before. I think the reason why the Iranians themselves played it up is because they were hoping to use that as a leverage against the West, particularly Europeans, to be able to say Iran has other options. Don't think that Iran is so desperate to get sanctions relief, particularly mindful of how unstable and unreliable it is, that it is forced to agree to all kinds of concessions in the nuclear deal because Iran has other options. It can look east. The Iranians have been talking about looking east for more than 2 decades. It is for the first time now starting to actually look like a potential option. And that, I think, is something that, again, the US is unhappy about, but is not yet willing to fully internalize. Because as you mentioned, that piece from Heritage is still acting as if we're in a world in which there is no China option for the Iranians, and that the US can just coerce Iran to do whatever it wants.
And from what we can tell, the Chinese option is certainly not enough.
Oh, certainly. I think at the end of the day, the Iranian economy will be able to, limp along if it only has trade with Russia and China, but it will not be able to flourish. It is nowhere near the degree of both technology and investments that they need. But at the same time, we should keep in mind, I don't think there's a very large number of people within the foreign policy elite that necessarily believes that that is their best option. I think they just
Oh,
don't
interesting.
believe there is a Western option any longer, because for a Western option to truly exist, it is not sufficient that every once in a while there's a president in the United States that wants to have a deal and wants to be able to reduce tensions. There has to always be a president in the United States that wants to keep such an agreement. Otherwise, there is no option. So it's not necessarily as much of a rejection of the West, rather than them feeling that the West has rejected them because the US pulled out. And as a result, they don't have an option to turn to the West.
You know, as we've been tracking this over the years, one of the things we keep coming up against is the human cost of this. What it means in terms of the number of people that are being pushed into poverty or not being lifted out of poverty based on the US sanctions. Would you comment on that?
I'm so happy you raised this issue. We actually do have a report that will come out from the Quincy Institute, hopefully within the next month, on this issue. There is a massive human cost in sanctions, particularly mindful of the fact that the use of economic sanctions, particularly broad-based economic sanctions, have just skyrocketed in the last 25 years. The United States, that used to be the country that other countries wanted to have a relationship with because it would help lift them up economically, is increasingly the country that is punishing others economically and depriving them of economic opportunities. The number of countries that are under some form of sanctions right now is just mind-staggering. And there's problems with this because oftentimes people have had the attitude in Washington that sanctions is an alternative to war. Sanctions is a humanitarian alternative to other forms of conflict. Reality is quite the opposite. First of all, research shows that once you go down the path of sanctioning another country economically, it tends to lead to an escalatory cycle, and it actually increases the risk of a military confrontation. It is not an alternative to war. It is both a stepping stone towards war, but also an alternative form of war. Because when it comes to war, we actually have rules. We're not allowed to bomb civilian infrastructure, bridges, airports, etc. Economic sanctions, broad-based economic sanctions, target entire civilian institutions. And it's oftentimes the poorest in the society that suffer the most because they have the least amount of protection. So we have large numbers of people dying, large numbers of things that in war you would not be allowed to target are directly being targeted by economic sanctions.
Wow.
We saw the State Department itself actually had a report, I think it was published in 2004, explaining why it had become so difficult to govern Iraq. One chapter dealt with the fact that Iraq had been under some of the worst economic sanctions for 10 years, and what that had done to the society and to state institutions. It pointed out, for instance, that because the sanctions had shrunk the Iraqi economy to no more than $16 billion at the time, the economic incentives of ordinary Iraqis changed dramatically. A lot of people stopped sending their girls to school because what was the value of educating girls to read, etc., when there were absolutely not an economy for them to be engaged in? So you actually had a reduction of female literacy in the country. Now you tell me, do you think it's more or less difficult to build democratic institutions in a country where female literacy is increasing dramatically?
The answer to that is obvious and tragic.
Exactly. But this is the hidden, almost invisible cost of sanctions that I think is really needs to be uplifted so that people understand. Because I think there's a lot of people who genuinely believe in Congress that when they cast a vote for sanctions, they took a step towards peace. They helped prevent a war. They did something that is more humanitarian. And reality is quite the opposite.
Yeah. And the result was clear because Iran's been under sanctions for over 30 years plus. And they was, the Iranians didn't sort of broke down in a way. Yes, they do have economic issues and so forth, but they were still standing, shall we say,
Yeah, I mean, we have almost no examples of a country being able to manufacture regime change in another country through economic sanctions. What you have is a lot of examples of economies being destroyed, lives being destroyed, societies being destroyed, which then leads to the government actually having a stronger control over the country and becoming more repressive. I mean, Iran's economic situation is nowhere near where Venezuela's is, but Maduro is still in power. So
Exactly.
Right.
even if it would take another 5 or 7 years of sanctions for the Iranian economy to reach the level of where Venezuela is today, the current regime would most likely still be in power. And by that time, probably would have gotten a nuclear weapon because their incentive structure would change, in which they likely would think that the only way to be able to push back against the sanctions and have leverage over the US is to actually build a nuclear. We should not incentivize them to go in that direction.
You know, one of the things I've heard you speak about before is, what if the U.S. had less of a footprint in the Middle East? Would these people actually talk to each other? Would they actually come to terms? And would you comment on that?
Absolutely. So a common theme in Washington and almost a holy mantra in this city is that if we leave a place militarily, chaos ensues. We're like the only thing that is standing between utter chaos and some variation of paradox. So it's tremendously self-flattering. Reality is, we have seen it just in the last 18 months. As the US has made clear that it is leaving, or at a minimum, it is not going to be as involved in the region militarily, it's not going to back some of the countries in the region in the manner that it has done before, which is essentially giving them a carte blanche. The opposite has happened. The region has not gone further into chaos. Rather, we have seen regional powers themselves starting to talk to each other and trying to find a way to resolve issues diplomatically. They may not succeed. We don't know yet.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's tremendously valuable because it shows regional diplomacy was always possible. So why did it not happen earlier? Well, in my view, part of it is that as long as the US was essentially giving some countries in the region a carte blanche, a blank check to do whatever they wanted, their incentive structure was such that hiding behind American military power was much better for them than to engage in diplomacy, which would be messy, time consuming. They would have to give
Yeah.
painful concessions.
Yeah.
So as long as the US was there to take care of their problems militarily, why engage in diplomacy? As soon as the US pulled out or began credibly signaling that it's going to happen, and we had a couple of events that verified it, such as when the Saudi oil fields were attacked, most likely by Iran, Donald Trump decided that he didn't want to go to war with Iran over Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were in a state of shock. What happened? Through Iraqi mediation, the Iranians and the Iraqis started talking to each other. That facilitation has now translated into mediation. And we're actually starting to see a rather robust dialogue between the Saudis and the Iranians aimed at normalizing their relationship, putting an end to the war in Yemen, and start addressing other conflicts as well, such as Lebanon. Again, it may not work out, but it's actually the best thing that could happen, because we need the countries in the region to show responsibility for their own security and act responsibly rather than recklessly. And we need to make sure that how they solve their problems is a way that works for them, not necessarily for us.
Right.
And that they should pay for it themselves. It should not be a burden to the American taxpayer, not because we're stingy, but because at the end of the day, we have problems at home that we also need to take care of and address, which we have neglected for a very long time. So I think it's a great thing. It's embarrassing to some elements in Washington because their theorem that, without us, everything goes to chaos is clearly being disproven.
Well, I'm sure, as you know, Trita, as one who, spent almost 18 years in Washington, D.C., so you kind of learn how things operate inside the Beltway. So when Washington doesn't like the message, they tend to shoot the messenger. You know how it is. But it was always that argument as to, how fragmented our foreign policy. And usually the Iraq war and the Afghan war, two fiascos, disaster. The question that many were asking, what did we get out of that? $6+ trillion lost. As you mentioned just earlier, we got issues right here. We got a crumbling infrastructure. We got an education system that needs to be revamped from top to bottom. We got a healthcare system that is, almost, yes, we do have a hospital, whatever, but it's broken. A tax system that needs a total revamp.
And homeless that live basically on the streets in every major city in the country.
So, and yet we
And
are going about engaging, and our foreign policy seems to be incohesive because we don't have a strategy in the first place. And you would wonder
I
who.
would differ a little bit.
Yeah.
Dave, I would differ a little bit. I agree 100% with your general criticism. I think you're spot on. I do think there is a grand strategy. I think it's absolutely the wrong grand strategy,
Mhm.
but it is so deeply embedded that most people are not even aware of what it is. In simple terms, let me say what I think the grand strategy is. It's the grand strategy of liberal hegemony or primacy, in which we essentially believe we make the world safer and we make ourselves safer by dominating every corner of the world militarily. That's why we have 750 plus military bases around the world. We have so many defense agreements with so many countries, and so many countries that we don't have defense agreements with, but we talk about them as if we do. We don't have a defense pact with Taiwan, but we're talking about it as if we're ready to go to war with China over Taiwan. And we can talk about whether that's right or wrong, but the bottom line is we don't have a defense pact, yet we are treating ourselves as if we do. That is a key reason as to why we are in these endless wars, because if we want to dominate the entire world militarily all over the place, then you will be at war somewhere all the time. And
Right.
that is what we have been for 25 plus years. It was rooted in the belief that this unipolar moment, that the United States was the answer to all of the problems of humanity, and that we truly were making the world better off. It's clearly shown that that is not the way things work. It's not working for the rest of the world. It doesn't work for the United States either, for the very same reasons you just pointed out. And let me just give you one piece of statistics from the Middle East. In 1998, there were 5 military conflicts in the Middle East. By 2020, we had 22 armed conflicts in the Middle East.
Oh my
And
God.
that is during the period that the United States was the military hegemon, and by that, responsible for the security of the region. All of those conflicts are, of course, at the end of the day, not the United States' fault necessarily, but the biggest one, the Iraq War, is entirely the US's fault, and that is the one that also led to many of these other conflicts. That is a track record of primacy and liberal hegemony. We need to fundamentally change that, in my view, go towards a grand strategy that is called restraint, which essentially said the United States should not dominate many of these different places because they're not strategically viable. The United States should be focused on protecting the American people.
Right.
And that means not that we should dominate the rest of the world, but
Yeah.
that we should make sure that no one else is necessarily dominating. So in the Middle East, our job should not be to dominate, but we should make sure that no other state from within or outside is taking the position of domination or has the ability to do so. That does not require 750 bases around the world,
Right.
does not require $800 billion to the Pentagon. That does not require us to constantly get into conflict with other countries or put ourselves in other countries' conflicts as a belligerent. It actually will enable us to mediate and facilitate peace treaties in a way that we cannot right now. It also would not justify constantly selling so much weapons to many other countries in the world, which is another way in which we get dragged into this. So I think it is absolutely fixable, but it requires more than a slight change of our foreign policy. It requires a paradigm shift in which we change our grand strategy.
Except that the Hawks Trita in Washington is not going to allow it.
Oh, they will fight it tooth and
Yeah,
nail.
yeah,
And one of the things we saw is that the pull out of Afghanistan was, of course, very popular outside of Washington,
yeah.
very unpopular in Washington.
Do you have any hope that policy is going to change? What I'm really asking is anyone listening to the good information that you have in Washington?
Oh, without a doubt, things are changing. Is it changing fast enough is perhaps the more accurate question. But I do believe things are changing. Again, it did take a lot of political courage and capital to pull out of Afghanistan. It frankly was easier for Biden to just continue the lies that the U.S. government has been feeding the American people for the last 20 years, constantly saying that we're making progress and we're going to turn a corner in 6 months. And we know from the Pentagon Papers that they themselves knew that those were lies. It would have been easier for him to do so, but he chose to change it because the politics of this is changing. And part of the reason the politics is changing is because the younger generation of Americans are growing up with very different values. They have only seen bad wars. This is not the generation of the Second World War where the United States saved the entire world and as a result have a very benign view of what US military force can do. They have only seen bad wars and bad military engagements from Iraq to Afghanistan to Syria to Libya. Secondly, I think they've also dramatically, and incidentally related to that is, they know that they're going to have a lower standard of living than their parents did. And they know that that is because of these wars. Secondly, they are also moving quite far away from the idea that the United States should even intervene in other countries militarily for the sake of human rights. They don't believe in that any longer. And they also don't believe in American exceptionalism in a way that would put the United States in a completely unique category. In fact, going back to what you said about our roads, our healthcare system, younger Americans are traveling outside of the United States to a far larger extent than previous generations did. They're seeing that the roads are better in Europe. They're seeing that the infrastructure is far better in China. They're seeing these things. And when you see it, it's a little difficult to constantly believe that, American exceptionalism puts us in a unique category above everyone else. And incidentally, what has happened in the last couple of years politically, again, also shows that we unfortunately are as susceptible to these negative political trends, potentially, and even an attempt at a coup, as is happening in other countries. We've been blessed from that for a very long period of time, which has fed into this belief that we have a unique, exceptional system. Now we know that we have to be more humble. We have problems, and we need to address those problems. And we cannot if we delude ourselves to think that we're just exceptional.
Yeah, that's one of the you're absolutely correct.
To add something to what you're saying before, I've recently been in China, recently been in Germany. The quality of almost everything was shocking compared to the city I live in. I mean, it really was eye-opening.
And that begs the thinking that probably Washington is having a hard time accepting the reality that the world or the landscape, the geopolitical landscape has shifted. We're no more or no longer the unipolar force that was taking care of the world per se, because now you get emerging countries, you got the whole global economy shifting to the east, has been shifting to the east for a while. And we're noticing that we're having a hard time accepting this reality. And it's almost the way I look at it, Trita, is the way we are behaving on a global stage, it's an indication that we don't know how to react to the changes that's taking place on a global stage.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a negative backlash here in the sense that we think that these are trends that we can stop by doubling down on the very militarism that actually got us to this point. That is the knee-jerk reaction to this. These are not trends that can be stopped. Historically, it's always been clear. Power is cyclical. Countries rise, countries fall. And at best, you can try to prolong your beneficial geopolitical situation as long as possible. That's what actually a grand strategy or restraint would have done if the US had adopted it in 1993, 94. Instead, we went for primacy. And what that actually meant in many different ways is that a period of American unipolarity that could have lasted perhaps 50 or perhaps 100 years ended up lasting no more than 25.
Yeah. And that is one of the things we're trying to literally promote in our channel, is the idea of we're trying to help people start to understand that every aspect of their life is tied to what's going on geopolitically. There are those who are saying, oh, we are here. What do we have to worry about what's going on the other side of the globe? But they never understood how we are interconnected globally, politically, geopolitically. They never understood. And we're trying to sort of promote that kind of understanding, that a peace, the existential peace or existence that is, will be beneficial to all of us.
All people have to do is look at grocery prices, inflation in general, what you're paying at the gas pump. If you're paying attention, you understand you are a citizen of the world, not just of your country. And everything is interconnected to everything else. One of our themes is we want to get the best possible information to people so they can make up their own minds. And all this at the backdrop of, if we're talking to each other, we stand a much better chance than than open warfare with each other, of getting something positive done.
And this is probably why, Ross, why you are noticing now, for example, in ASEAN,
Yeah.
ASEAN countries did not want to, no matter what the US says, they like this seeing where this is going, and they deciding we don't want to be part of, you got issues with China, you deal with China. We don't want to get involved in it. I mean, I remember when Moon Jae-in was in Washington, which was only a few months ago, and he was pressured by the administration for him to sort of say negative stuff about China. And he said, no, I ain't going to do it. I have my economy that is tied to the Chinese market. Why will I do that? Why will I risk, aggravating the whole economic process or progress for my country so I can please Washington? So Australia, on the other hand, ended up taking a different route. And we all know what the outcome is. So, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to truly to talk to you, because, as I told Russ, and I said, listen, our viewers, based on what they have been suggesting, but that is the right person to address this issue of the Iran nuclear deal, because he has an understanding that will go beyond just what it means for the Middle East. We're talking about the global landscape here.
I'd like to go backwards for just a minute and
Sure.
ask a question, because I've heard you talk about this, and I think it'd be really important for our viewers to hear an answer. Do you have any hope that Israel would actually come to negotiate with Iran, Iraq, and everybody else they're in trouble with? Because if the United States just pulled out and said, you're on your own, negotiate something, how hopeful are you that they actually would?
So look, I think the Israelis actually would be more than happy to sit down with the Iranians. It's the Iranians that don't want to do that, because the Israelis want to have that recognition from the Iranians. The Iranians have refused to recognize Israel as a state. So there, I don't think that is the issue. I think the issue is more that what the Israelis are doing in terms of not negotiating with the Palestinians, continuing to occupy and expand the occupation, could not be done if it had not been for the type of implicit or explicit green light that they've been given by the United States. Very explicit during the terms of the Trump administration, in which there were people inside the administration, including the ambassador to Israel, that was pushing for annexation. And this could never have been done without this. So on that front, I think it would be absolutely crucial. And we've seen just lately, what has happened just in the last week or so, with the Israelis now putting a lot of Palestinian human rights organizations on the terrorist list. These are the measures that you expect in some very, very authoritarian states to do as a way of getting rid of human rights organizations, etc. And the response from the Biden administration was almost nothing. This is highly problematic, because bottom line is what the Israelis do in these regards, because everyone does understand that they couldn't have done it without an implicit approval, or at least no objection from the US, means that it backfires on the US. It further entangles the United States in the Middle East, and it's ultimately really to the detriment of the US's own national interests. So even if if you don't come at it from the perspective that, there should be equality between Israelis and Palestinians, bottom line is this is really unhelpful for U.S. national interest in and of itself. It's the same thing as when the Saudis are conducting these bombing campaigns in Yemen and the humanitarian crisis. This could not be done without A, U.S. green light, B, the U.S. is still servicing the Saudi Air Force. It says that it's not providing any more support for offensive weapons or operations. But bottom line, Saudi Arabia is still imposing a blockade on Yemen, which is the main cause for the starvation of millions of people there. And that is not a defensive weapon. That is an offensive weapon. And we're still not putting enough pressure on the Saudis to stop that, which means that conflict and the suffering there also backfires on the United States.
May I ask another clarifying question I've been really curious about? Because I've watched this thing for years and years now. Is there I'm looking for incentives and disincentives for Iran to be building a nuclear bomb. And if you comment on what are the disincentives for them to build it?
So I think that's a really important question, because oftentimes in Washington, the assumption is they just want the bomb.
You're right.
And as a result, there's nothing you can do to change their incentives. And as we talked about earlier on, if that is as simple as it is, why have they had a nuclear program since 1968 and not gotten involved? There's some very natural, clear geopolitical reasons as to why they haven't. If you take a look, and this been incidentally has been mentioned by the Iranians in nuclear negotiations as well as track 2, and it actually goes back to the era of the Shah himself. The Shah of Iran had a nuclear program. He was strongly encouraged by the United States to have a nuclear program. In fact, 2 individuals that played a key role in convincing the Shah to have a nuclear program and to buy American reactors for that program were Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who served in the Ford administration.
Yeah.
Shocking.
But, and the Shah was doing things that clearly was not just for civilian use, but he didn't build the weapon. And he was confronted by this by the number 2 person in the Iranian Atomic Energy Agency saying, you know, we can buy all of these different things, but we don't need them. Why do you want those? And he made it very clear that because the US ambassador had made it clear to the Shah that the US would not go to war with the Soviet Union over Iran. Iran was not a member of NATO. Iran was in a strategically lonely position. And the Shah calculated that it would be bad for Iran to build a nuclear weapon, but it would be good for Iran to have an option to build a nuclear weapon in case the geopolitical situation deteriorated dramatically. But the reason why it would be bad for Iran to build a nuclear weapon is because it would break the NPT, would face some international isolation. But most important, look at the map. Iran is a major power in the Middle East. It has a conventional superiority because of size and of populations and size of the country as a whole. If the Iranians were to build a nuclear weapon, it would risk creating an arms race in the region in which other countries would build it as well. As an example, if tiny Bahrain, which is a very small country, very, very small population, as a result also would build a nuclear weapon, what would happen? The consequence would be that Iran would have eliminated its conventional superiority, and Iran and Bahrain would be at parity because both of them could destroy the other. It would mean that Iran would actually forego a natural superiority in terms of size that it has by creating a level playing field in which every country, regardless of size, would roughly be of the same power because they would have the doomsday weapon. This is part of the reason why 2 of the most populous states in the region, Egypt and Iran, in 1973, took the initiative for a Middle East free, a WMD-free Middle East. No weapons of mass destruction, no nuclear weapons in the Middle East, because those are the 2 countries that would lose the most if the region nuclearized. If you're a much smaller state, such as Israel, with very little, if any strategic depth, your calculus is very, very different. In fact, an Israeli general told me this himself. He said the biggest mistake India ever committed was to test the nuclear weapon. Because when they tested the nuclear weapon, so did the Pakistanis. And suddenly, India, that is 10 times the size of Pakistan, were an equal to Pakistan because both of them had nuclear weapons. It was a big mistake. The Iranians are well aware of this. So they have their own natural incentives not to go in that direction. We can unfortunately change those incentives in the wrong direction, because if there's one thing that potentially would convince them that they need to have a nuclear weapon, it is the threat that the United States would attack Iran. The United States doesn't attack countries that have nuclear weapons. And because tensions between the US and Iran have gone so high, it actually incentivizes them to potentially have nuclear weapons as a deterrence against the United States.
One last question from me. We've been looking at the possibility that Israel is attempting to line up the United States against Iran for some purpose.
Yeah.
So, sorry, could you repeat?
Say it again, please.
I didn't quite hear you.
Well, I've heard it. Israel is disincentivized in some ways to establish peace with Iran. I wonder if you had any ideas about that.
I think actually the Israelis, if they could find a way to come to terms with the Iranians, I don't think that they would necessarily be against that they had a relationship with Iran during the time of the Shah. And there's plenty of Israelis that would have loved to go back to that relationship. What they're more worried about is that the United States and Iran will come to terms with each other. And that would then leave the Israelis out. That the US will make a deal with Iran, but Iran will not make a deal with the Israelis. That is part of their concern. And this was made very clear. There was a meeting in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, one of these track 2 meetings. It was a unique one, I would say, because there were several American officials in the room. You had 5 Israelis, including 1 or 2 very, very senior officials and former officials. And you had 3-4 senior Iranian officials in the room, including a member of the Iranian nuclear negotiations. And there were discussions. At one point, the most senior Israeli fellow said that this was never about enrichment. This was never about the enrichment of uranium, which kind of shocked the room because for a decade, 2 decades almost, the Israelis have been saying that enrichment of uranium is an existential threat to Iran, to Israel. Instead, he said, no, the issue is that Israel wants to see a sweeping attitude change on behalf of the Iranians. And then he explained what that meant. It meant that Israel will never allow the United States to come to terms with Iran if Iran does not first come to terms with Israel.
Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense, yes.
Because if the Iranians were to come to terms with the US, what would happen? The US would have a much easier time leaving the Middle East, shifting its focus to China or to other problems. But Israel would still be stuck in the region with Iran without the Iranians coming to terms with Israel. And that would then kick in what they call abandonment, that the United States would abandon Israel to face Iran alone without US backing. So and because the Israelis are more or less convinced that the Iranians will not come to terms with the Israelis, they prefer then to make sure that Iran also doesn't manage to come to terms with the United States. Part of the reason, I would say the key reason as to why the Israelis were so adamant against the JCPOA.
Interesting. And that's what we call geopolitics in play.
Yeah.
So any final word, Trita, before we let you go?
No, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me. Now you say that the final thing is, I really hope more and more Americans start looking at these issues and start off with the most fundamental question. What is the US's interest in this? No one in this town, for instance, have been able to explain to me what the interest of the United States is in being a part of the war in Yemen. Whether the Houthis like the US or not, they're not a threat to the United States. So why are we involved? And start asking that for every conflict that they hear about or that we are involved in. Because oftentimes the best option is actually for us not to be there. But the way these conflicts are presented in the media and the mainstream conversations about this, the option of not being involved is never, ever presented. So the viewers have to really think through these things very carefully themselves to even be able to come up with that alternative as an option.
Well, that's great. So before I let you go, Trita, where can our viewers find you if they want to learn more about you? I know some of them know who you are, but overall, where our viewers can go to?
They should go to 2 places. First, they should go to my own website, tritaparsi.com. They will find my articles, and they should sign up for, follow me on Twitter at tparsi. Where I always put up all the things that I produce. But they should also go to the Quincy Institute's website, which is quincyinst.org. quincyinst.org. That's the address for our organization. We have plenty of excellent scholars who are all here to help move the United States' foreign policy and grand strategy away from military domination and towards restraint.
And we want our viewers to know that we will have those links also. What Dr. Parsi just mentioned, we will have them right in the description below. So, any final words, Ross?
Thank you so much. This has been a fabulous conversation with you today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
My pleasure.
We truly appreciate you taking the time. I know how busy you are because I've been following your work for quite a while. So I know how busy you are, and we hope to have you back here for further conversation.
Anytime.
This is what our viewers want. So
anytime.
To all our viewers, remember to subscribe to our channel. Remember to follow us on Twitter. on TikTok and on Instagram. But also remember our membership at the geopoliticsinconflict.com, where we're going to do, Elizabeth, right? We're going to do some presentations and live Q&A. So we hope to have you there. And to all of you, as always, stay informed. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.